Hello and welcome to our lecture on cross-sectional studies. In our last lecture, we did an overview of several different study designs that we're going to be talking about in class. This lecture is just going to be focused on one of those study designs, and that is the cross-sectional study. So today we're going to talk about the observational versus experimental studies and descriptive versus analytic studies. We're also going to review our overview of the cross-sectional study design. We'll discuss prevalence, which is the key statistical measure for cross-sectional studies, and we will also compare that to incidence, which is a key statistical measure for another of the studies that we will, another of the study designs that we will be discussing in depth. We'll also discuss survey design for cross-sectional studies, and then we'll go back and we'll calculate prevalence. So this is our observational versus experimental studies little infographic that we looked at a little bit in the end of last lecture. This infographic divides our case or our study designs into observational and experimental. And remember, experimental studies are the only type of study that fall under experimental in the experimental category. We also have this other category of observational, where we are not manipulating any variables. We are just simply looking to see what is happening and then kind of reporting on it. And the observational category includes the case series or the case study, cross-sectional studies, case control studies, and cohort studies. Now you see we have another box for categories here. We have descriptive and analytic, and these are other categories that describe either an observational study or an experimental study. So we have descriptive studies which have no comparison groups. So descriptive studies, which include the case series or the case study and the cross-sectional study, merely observe something and then report what was observed. Whereas in our analytic studies, which include our case control studies, our cohort studies, and our experimental studies, we're going to analyze our results because we will have a comparison group. Most likely we will have a comparison group, and we will be able to analyze our results, and then we can present our results. So today we're talking about cross-sectional studies, and remember, a cross-sectional study is a study that describes an exposure or disease status in a population at a particular point in time. So this particular point in time can be a single time period or a single very well-defined time period. And what we're looking for is an association between things that occur in the same slice of time. Remember, this is our cross-section of the foot, which if we imagine this to be time, we're just taking a slice of time and seeing if there are two or more things that are occurring simultaneously or close to each other in time. We're seeing if there is an association, and then we can measure the strength of that association. There is no comparison group, and this can be primary or secondary research. So here is our cross-section of time, of a clock, right? And so our cross-sectional study takes, okay, let's study things that occur in this period of time, or in this well-defined period of time, or in this longer well-defined period of time. We're going to see if two things occur simultaneously. So we can see, we can look at a question like, what is the prevalence of asthma in college students in Naperville? And we can see if there's a high prevalence. Like, we take a group of people and we ask them, or we can look through medical records if we're doing secondary research, and we find how many of the people that we have included in our study have asthma. Is there an association between having asthma and being a college student? We can see that, and we can measure the strength of that association. So perhaps we find a high prevalence, and then we say, ooh, why is the prevalence of asthma in college students in Naperville so high? Could it be because there's more air pollution here? Could it be because they were all exposed to a certain exposure? Then we can move on with a different study design to kind of assess possible causes. So cross-sectional studies are also called prevalence studies. And like I said before, prevalence is the key statistical measure for cross-sectional studies. Prevalence is a measure of the proportion of a population who have a particular exposure or disease at a particular point in time. So there's this example of the bathtub. So if we look at our bathtub at a certain point in time, the water that is in the tub represents the prevalent cases. So we look at our section of time and we see who has the disease at that point in time. And those would be our prevalent cases. Now, there are also new cases that may be occurring, and the new cases are called incident cases or incidents. And those cases can be compared to the water flowing into the bathtub during that particular point in time. What we're looking at for cross-sectional studies is just the prevalent cases, just the cases that exist, just the water that is in the bathtub at the point in time that we are. So cross-sectional studies can be used to describe communities. They can be used to assess population needs. They can be used to support program planning, to monitor and evaluate programs, and also to establish baseline data prior to proceeding with other studies. So a simple cross-sectional study design could be set up in the following way. First, you recruit some people, a few hundred people or so. Those people have to be representative of a well-defined population. They could be like patients of a clinical practice or students of a school, residents of a neighborhood, but the people that you choose to participate in your study have to be representative of that particular population. You can ask them to complete a short questionnaire, and then you can report on the data from the questionnaire. How do we report on that data? Well, we can find out the prevalence of a particular disease or exposure in that population. Prevalence can be calculated as the number of cases divided by your study population. And then we have two kinds of prevalence. There's point prevalence, which is measured at one point in time, and then period prevalence, which is measured over a certain well-defined period of time. And we can answer the question, what is the prevalence of asthma in college students in Naperville in September 22? So if I want to answer this question and I want to come up with a study design, the first thing I would do is recruit some college students in Naperville. We would want to make sure that they are actually college students, not people just walking down the street. We would want to make sure that they are college students in Naperville, not college students visiting from out of town, because you want them to be representative of your well-defined population, and that's college students in Naperville. We'll ask them, do you have asthma? Yes, no, and then we report on the data. Prevalence. So we are going to find out what is the prevalence of asthma in college students in Naperville. We do our cross-sectional study. We have our results from our questionnaire in our table right over here. So we found a population of 250 college students in Naperville, and we surveyed them. We found that 50 of them have asthma, and 200 of them do not have asthma. Now, this is hypothetical data. I didn't really survey college students in Naperville, but with our results, we find out what the prevalence of asthma is among this population. So using our formula, number of cases divided by the population gives us a prevalence of 20%. So in summary, about cross-sectional studies, we can say these are descriptive studies. There is no comparison group. This is concentrating on a well-defined period of time or one point in time, also a well-defined population. We can describe an association, but we cannot assess causality, right? That means we cannot assess the cause of a condition. So if we're thinking about our college students who have asthma, we can say, does asthma cause, or does being a college student in Naperville cause asthma? Well, we can't say that. All we can say is that 20% of those surveyed did have asthma. Now we can use that data to come up with a hypothesis, and then we can test the hypothesis using another study design. Finally, prevalence is the main statistical measure